This lesson will describe how people perceive information in visualization. As we've touched on a little bit, physical interaction through a mouse or keyboard is only part of the way that we interact with and navigate data. So much of our own sense making with data happens as a result of the evolutionary processes that have developed over time to help us see and make sense of the world. In this lesson, we'll cover some of the basics of why we care about visual perception and cognition, and how different phenomena within visual perception actually will go ahead and influence the choices we make when we're trying to effectively represent different kinds of information. So I want to illustrate the power of perception with a quick example. This is a data set that's called Anscombe's Quartet. So I have 4 different samples of data, and I've computed the high-level first-order statistics, mean, variance, correlation, and regression for each of these 4 samples. If you take a minute and reflect on this data, you might start thinking these data sets look awfully similar. And in fact, the statistics are actually identical. But the power of the visual system is it allows us to see and make sense of patterns that statistics may not be able to capture nearly as intuitively. For example, if I visualize these 4 data sets, I can see that they have very similar statistics, but they have completely different structures. I have in blue a general relatively linear pattern with some noise. In orange, a perfectly constant pattern with an outlier. In red, a quadratic parabolic shape. And in green, a linear pattern with a single outlier. So even though we can readily see, enumerate, and describe these structures, they may not show up in our simple statistical measures. Well, what's happening here? What enables us to do this? If we look at these 2 scatter plots as a preliminary example, we look at the scatter plots and we process them over time. This time continuum starts with our sense of sight. Essentially, light from the red and the orange points goes into the eye and fires off a set of signals to start the process of interpreting this information. Then some magic happens, and after that, we develop our new insights or our new knowledge about that data. For example, we might say, well, their statistics match. One of these data sets, the orange data set, is primarily linear, while the other is quadratic. So this begets the question, what is this magic? What is happening between our sense of sight and our sense of insight? And how can we use this inference, this set of processes, to make sure that people develop the knowledge that they need to from our visualizations? Well, this all gets down to this basic idea of why we care about visual perception in data visualization. Visual perception tells us the mechanisms by which people interpret data. In other words, it describes how do we get from pixels on a screen to a sense of structure in information. And if we understand those mechanisms, we can start to create visualizations that let people see what we need them to. It also allows us to make predictive rather than prescriptive guidelines. If we understand how visual information is processed, we can describe how design choices will affect data interpretation. We can also construct models that systematically characterize how visualizations work for different tasks and designs. We've already talked about one of these models in terms of CIA Lab in our lesson about color, but the foundational ideas here go even deeper. We can create quantitative models that allow us to match our visualizations to what we need people to see in their data using quantitative models with simple tasks and designs. But we also have conceptual models about how different design elements might work and how they might complement each other to try to understand and build more complex representations with data. In the context of perception in visualization, the remainder of this lesson will be divided into 2 videos. The first of these focuses on what is called the pre-attentional phase. So this is all the stuff that happens right away before we even realize what we're looking at in the first 500 milliseconds or less of looking at a visualization. And it turns out, depending on how you design your visualization, you can guide people and create a lot of knowledge and associations and patterns in the data before people even realize what it is they're looking at. From there, we'll move on into more of the conscious elements of visual perception. So thinking about what happens when people are actively using and engaged with a visualization. And these relate to concepts called attention and search. So we'll talk about different kinds of attention. We'll talk about what happens when a visualization changes and what are some of the limitations of that. And we'll also talk about how people look for and make sense of and find information in a visualization. One quick caveat before we get going is that you will hear me use the word visual system frequently throughout these videos. So when I talk about the visual system, it is the way our eyes and our brain work together to help us see the world and to make sense of what we see. And it turns out the visual system is an incredibly powerful tool for data analytics if we know how to use it right.